everybody. My name is Graeme Pate. I've been the disembodied voice you've been hearing most of the day. This is the real me. Thank you for joining me. I realize it's getting late in the day, and some of you have been here all day along with me, so thank you for your perseverance. So I'm going to spend a bit of time with you talking about things you can do in a synchronous room beyond just maybe a Q&A. We're going to move beyond this idea of a Q&A. For example, a lot of people have been coming to CTL and asking us questions about what can I do for a synchronous input. I thought I could do just a Q&A. Nothing wrong with that. Some people have been saying I want to do a lecture too, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But we're going to move beyond that. So first of all, before we move beyond the Q&A, we're going to move a little bit beyond the Q&A. But before we do that, let's actually talk about the Q&A. So if you're doing a question and answer session, one of the things that you might want to think about is to use a Q&A Google form like we've been using throughout the whole day today. You may find that it's useful because, as Cosette said, we want to avoid those distractions. And as you know, all day long, the chat has been off most of the time, but I've been adding little advertisements as we've gone through. And some people have found them helpful, and I'm sure some people have found them a little bit distracting. So you may want to have a Q&A Google form like we've been using to allow the students to ask their questions, and then you can respond to them. So what we've been doing, we set up a Google form. In Google, you can also have a spreadsheet. A Google form goes into a spreadsheet automatically. So while you've been throwing out your questions into the Q&A rooms, my colleagues and our guest speakers were going into the spreadsheet section and looking at those questions. And the nice thing about doing this is it means that people can ask a question without it being announced to everyone. And there are two good reasons for that. One, it means that people feel a bit more comfortable asking a question because it's kind of anonymous. Only the instructor is going to see it. So if they ask a question which they might perceive as silly or dumb, or they're not sure about it, if they know it's being posted anonymously and their colleagues can't see it, there's more chance they'll ask the question. But equally, and it's a little bit sneaky, but the other point is the fact that you can, as the instructor, look through those list of questions and go, no, I'm not answering that question. I'm not going to answer that because I know I'm going to discuss it later on, or it's too complicated at the moment, or I've already answered it, or it's in the textbook, they should have known the answer to that, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of triage the questions you want to answer. But the other thing you might want to do is to give the students questions in advance. So give the students questions in advance, which can then be discussed during the synchronous input. So you have a Q&A, you give them those questions, they can think about it and come in and hopefully have some responses, which hopefully will lead to more questions. It's a good idea, as we were doing today, to record any Q&A, record the responses you give, record the questions they ask, and if possible, provide a transcript. Now, the nice thing about using Zoom, especially with our U of A accounts, is that it'll do that automatically. When you go into the settings, one of the options is to create a report, and create a transcript, I should say. So use that facility. So when you finish your Zoom talk, your Zoom synchronous input, you end the meeting, and then 5 minutes later or so, if you go into your Zoom account at zoom.us, then and log in using your Google account, then you'll see the transcript, and you could just paste that into eClass if you wanted to. So this is some ideas about when you are doing a Q&A. So again, speaking about Q&As, if you do have a question as I'm going through this, feel free to go to ctl.guide/QA-Graeme. I bet you probably figured out that was the link. So that's there for you too. So no matter what you decide to do, and by the way, I should point out that I don't have all the answers. I'm not a guru. I'm not sitting here cross-legged and have all the ideas in my yak milk beside me. At the end of the day, what I'm going to say to you comes from experience and also comes from the research. I'll give you access to the research as well, which happens to be on TELUS Aspire, the new thing that the library was telling about. So I'll give you links to that. I don't have all the answers. So I can only go by my own experience in the research. I think it's important to know that we at CTL, we have a lot of experience, but we don't know your subject. We know teaching, we know good learning, but we don't know your subject, and the two have to come. Walk over my microphone there. The two have to come together. So these ideas are here to give you ideas and to maybe get your mind thinking about other things you could do. This is not the be all and end all of answers. But the other thing that's worth pointing out is that when we go through this talk, this is not linear. The talk is obviously linear, but the points I'm making almost come together. They come together in a group. So please don't think of them as all separate. They all link to each other. So it's important to remember that. But whatever you decide to do based upon the input I'm going to talk about today, it is particularly important that you think about making it relevant. I mean, it seems obvious, but you need to make it relevant. So if you want your students to be engaged, and this links very closely to what Cosette was saying, if you want your students to be engaged, then they have to believe that what they're learning is relevant. It seems obvious, but sometimes we forget that. And it's easy because you're too busy thinking about, I have to create this, I have to make this, I have to get this video done. And then you forget, well, why am I doing this again? What is the purpose of this? And how does this relate to the students? How will the students see that this is relevant to their degree, to their course, to their readings, etc.? So just keep that in the back of your mind, whatever action you're doing besides a Q&A. One of the things to avoid is repeating what's already been learned. If you've made a video, for example, and you've put it online and they've watched it, then in your session synchronously, don't just repeat the same thing. The research is saying this over and over again for online learning. Do not repeat what you've already taught. Do not repeat what you've already taught. He says, repeating what he's just said. This is so important, and because then students are going to get turned off. They'll say, well, why did I have to come to this synchronous meeting when we just did that in a video? So please think about making sure that it's relevant and that you're not repeating yourself. It's really helpful. Again, the research is showing that if you can make it learner-centered, links exactly what Cosette was saying, make it learner-centered rather than instructor-centered. Now, at the moment, this particular synchronous input is instructor-centered. I am giving you knowledge. I'm just giving a knowledge transfer. And that is the one thing that, again, the research very clearly says that's something you should avoid doing. Try to avoid, and sometimes it isn't possible, but you want to try to avoid long sessions of you just spewing knowledge to students in a synchronous environment. That's the thing that you should be doing asynchronously. If you're just giving knowledge, get it in a video or a web page or whatever, and have them read that or watch that or engage with that on their own time. And when they come into class, it's synchronously, that's where it needs to focus on them as the learner. How can you as the instructor help the learner to be more effective in what they have learned? I'll talk about how you do that in a moment. Okay, as I've just said. So your knowledge transfer should avoid a lecture. So please, if you're doing synchronous inputs, no problem with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you are just going to have them come together and you're going to do a lecture, you're going to find that the students are going to disengage very quickly because they are going to ask, why did I have to come to this particular class at this particular time to listen to a lecture when I could have watched it on my own time? Now, traditionally, of course, we have a timetable and they come to a lecture hall, and of course, that's the time. But we're in a very different environment now. So we have to think very, very differently about how we are engaging our students and how we are giving that knowledge to them. So when you do get together with the students synchronously, one of the things that you can do is to dig deeper. And again, this will link to a lot of the other things I say. Just think about digging deeper into the knowledge that they've already learned. So for example, you could do exactly what I'm doing right now and what we've all been doing throughout the day is to share your monitor and to show a video or to show a slide or a graph and dig deeper. So they've already done this learning on their own time. It's a video you've created, and now they come to class, the synchronous input, and you say, remember in that video when we talked about this particular item? I'd like to dig a bit deeper into this and really, really kind of get into the nitty gritty. But again, you don't want it to be a lecture. I mean, you could maybe talk for 5 or 10 minutes and then you'd go on to another activity, which we'll go into. But the synchronous inputs will provide you with an opportunity to really, really get to grips with a particular concept that they've already got the groundwork done for. You could use a whiteboard. You could just use the Zoom. Zoom has a whiteboard. It's really challenging to write on it, I have to admit, unless you've got a tablet. But you could do what I do. I've got a chalkboard behind me. There's a chalkboard behind me. So I could, in fact, just actually go to my chalkboard and do my lecture and write on the chalkboard. This looks a bit awkward, but it does work. So that's an option as well. One of the things you have to watch out for if you do that, if you do have like a chalkboard or a marker chalkboard, wow, that's pretty retro. If you have a marker board and you are writing on it, there is an option in Zoom to flip your screen horizontally. So you may find that the text is actually backwards for the readers. So you need to make sure that you flip it. And this is an option in Zoom, so just be aware of that. I have to say, if you are able to connect your computer to another monitor, having two, especially when you're doing something like this, you want to present, it makes a huge difference. So it's well worth it. But the problem is sometimes you end up looking at a screen like this because your information's there. So you have to be aware of that. But if you do have the ability to connect to their monitor, it really does make quite a difference. Okay, again, one thing you can do is you can link it to a tablet. So if you're in Zoom, you can, if it's an iPad, for example, it's really simple to do it through Wi-Fi. You can link to a tablet and draw. So if you're doing any kind of mathematical symbols or anything that involves more complicated drawing, then you connect it to your iPad and you can draw on things. Lots of videos out there on YouTube which will show you how to do that. It's very, very simple. And that gives you the flexibility to demonstrate in more detail. And you can expand on one aspect from the asynchronous learning, which is what I mentioned before. It's, for example, you've done that Q&A, you've asked them questions in advance, you've given them that Google form, and there's one question that really jumps out and you go, oh, that's a good question. So when we come to the synchronous input, I want to spend a bit of time digging into that a bit deeper. Okay, so that's one option. When you are working synchronously, dig deeper. Another option is to look at case studies. Or look at scenarios, in other words. So this is another thing you can do when you're in a synchronous input, and this provides opportunities to demonstrate the relevance of what is being learned. They've learned these videos, they've got that knowledge, and now you're going to explain how that's relevant because you're going to give them a case study. In my experience, working with pre-service educators, and working with child development, my case studies, which I did every week, allowed the students to see how that research they had done, how they're learning about Vygotsky or Bronfenbrenner or whatever. Why was that important to learn? Why did I have to learn that? Well, the case study would give them something relevant. You're in a school, this is happening. How would the learning you've done about child development link to that? And I found that to be extremely helpful to help the students to make those connections, to help them to see the relevance. Case studies also provide opportunities for collaborative learning. Now, we're all learning online. We're all going to be online. So it's really hard to build relationships. It's very difficult. In a class situation, they're working with people. They can see each other. They're face-to-face. They're in groups. A bit more difficult when it's all online and on Zoom. So a case study provides those opportunities for collaborative learning, to work with a smaller group. Jen, for example, had breakout rooms earlier on. So breakout rooms is a really easy way to have everyone together synchronously, give them a case study, they go into their breakout rooms, and they work on a case study. And you, as the instructor or the co-host, if you have TAs and so on who are co-host, you could pop into each room. Now, I always like to say, think of this as if it were a real building. So you have these breakout rooms, and each breakout room is literally a different room in the building. So you can't go into more than one room at a time, okay, unless you clone yourself. You can't do that. So you can only go into one room, see how they're getting on, leave them alone, come out, go into another room, and so on. So you can't be in more than one room at a time. So that can be a little bit limiting, but that's okay, as long as you're aware of that and the students are aware of that. So a case study is really helpful. It makes it relevant, and you can have collaborative learning. Case studies also provide opportunities to use those learned knowledges that they've got and to improve their analysis skills and critical thinking. The research makes this very clear. Case studies, really good for this. They've learned something, and now they have to analyze something through a case study. They have to really think critically about what they have learned and how they put it into practice. So you've got maybe an hour or 2 hours with your students in a day, an hour probably. Then maybe you do a 5 or 10 minute quick Q&A, or you check something out, and then maybe you do a case study for 30 minutes. You introduce the case study for 5 minutes, and they do the work. Or maybe the case study is available on eClass in advance. And then once they come to the synchronous input already knowing what the case study is, and then they get put into groups and they work on it. It's up to you. Case studies also generate discussion, which leads to yet more knowledge as participants learn from each other. Again, the research makes this very clear. You're talking about a particular issue. You're talking about the learning that you've done. You have to put that knowledge into place, and you have to put it into practice. And as you are looking at the case study, you go, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. And sometimes you read something, and we know students do this, and I do this as well. You read something, you get some knowledge, and then you talk to others, and you go, oh, I didn't interpret it that way. I interpreted that differently. So sometimes case studies can help to generate that knowledge and go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, we should find out more about that. We've read that. We know the knowledge, but this case study is asking for more. We need to find out more. So that's one idea. Okay, Noreen's asking a question about predetermining which students go into a Zoom breakout room. The answer is yes, but it's really complicated. You have to have the school list has to be in a spreadsheet. I mean, you can do it, and there are videos on YouTube which show you how, but to be honest, it's really a pain. If you've got like less than 20 students and you really want students to be in a specific group, you could do it manually. The other way of doing it, it's a bit of a cheat, is to, when the students come in, get them to rename themselves. So if they know that they're in group one, get them to name themselves like one hyphen and then their name. So you'll have 4 people called one hyphen Susan, one hyphen Xiaoting, one hyphen whatever. And then when you are manually putting them into a room, it's really simple because you just find all the ones and go, put that into room 1, put that into room 1. And then group 2 would have 2 hyphens, so on. It's a bit of a cheat, but it works really well. Now, if you've got like 150 students, then that's probably not going to work very well, to be honest. So it works better in smaller groups. What's your thought about doing a synchronous lecture that's also recorded? Well, yes, I would record it. I know there are issues with that, and I understand that, but we're looking into, on our website, you'll find information about FOIP, and you'll find that the university is saying that if you are recording your class for an asynchronous input, then you're fine. You can do that. I would certainly recommend it because you may have students who are overseas, who are working in a different time zone. So you may have a synchronous input, which is great. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but that's, maybe it's like 1 o'clock in the morning in Bangladesh or something. So you have to be aware of how your synchronous input may not be easy for someone else to get to. Equally, as we found this morning, someone's computer may go down. I mean, Tommy's internet went out in the middle of his keynote speech. So recording it's not a bad idea, so you have a backup. The other thing you can do if you're really, really not comfortable with recording it is you could do what we're doing today, and you could record the live captions, and then you can make the text available. I personally don't think that's the best way because I think it's always challenging to try to learn something through reading just text. But certainly recording, I think, is a very wise idea. It allows those who cannot make it for genuine reasons to still engage. If you're doing breakout rooms, then it's a bit more difficult. So what I would do is if you're going to do breakout rooms on a consistent basis, you may want to think of what could an alternative task be for students who are unable to come to the synchronous input or for whatever reason. Maybe it's just a reflection or something. Is there a simple way to give a shared writing means like a Google Doc to each group in a breakout room? No. That's the answer. No. You can give a file to everybody, but you can't give it to an individual group. What you could do though is someone in the group could post a file within the group. So you may want, maybe you target certain individuals and it's their job to download a file to have on their computer. And then when they go into the breakout room, then they could share it with the others. But if you're going to do that, you're as well just putting it on eClass for everybody. Another thing, again, these all interact. So please don't think of these as all separate things. They all link together. So we talked about digging deeper. We talked about other things like that. So breakout rooms, so collaborative learning. Breakout rooms are very good for collaborative learning. So again, you have a scenario, for example, you put them into a breakout room and they're working collaboratively. It doesn't have to be that. It could be other things as well. And I'm going to give you some examples. So for example, you could have them do a presentation. So you say, okay, you're going to work together to present something. And we're going to talk about presentations a little bit more later on. You could talk about demonstrations. But also, the nice thing about collaborative learning is that you're building relationships. It comes back to this again. I think it's easy to forget that while we're so busy right now worrying about creating our videos and getting it all online and making sure students are engaged and thinking about assessment and exams, it can get quite overwhelming for us, and we understand that. But it's easy to forget that a very important part of a university experience is building relationships. And it's very difficult to do that when it's completely online. So I would encourage you to take a breath and think about how are you providing those opportunities to build those kind of relationships in your course. Now, we're not expecting you to spend a whole hour doing relationship building exercises. That's not at all what we're saying. but it is part of the university experience and part of the learning to work with others and to build friendships and build relationships. So collaborative learning as part of your synchronous input is a really good way to do that. The other thing about collaborative learning is it provides these opportunities to be exposed to diverse perspectives. The research shows this very clearly as well. You are working together on something. I mentioned the example earlier on. If you've done the reading in advance, you've watched the video, and you've figured out something and you've understood something one particular way. But what about someone else? I mean, where's the Indigenous perspective, for example? So when you are working together and you're building these relationships, other people have different perspectives that can help people to learn and grow and experience new things. And that's very, very important. I mentioned, I wanted to come back to this, is this demonstrating learning. This is a really important one. And again, it also links back to what I mentioned about making sure it's student-centered rather than instruction-centered. So let's look at demonstrating learning. And I'm going to suggest, and this is not perfect, these four letters in red, in yellow, RIDE, reflection, information, demonstration, and explanation, are four things you can do. So for example, when you are working synchronously, and maybe they're working in groups, see how they all kind of interrelate, that's what I'm talking about. Maybe you're going to have them create their own website. In my experience, what I did in one example was with my students, they were learning about the impact of being left-handed in young children when they first start school. What is the impact that they have being left-handed? And so they could have written a paper, they could have done a presentation using PowerPoint or whatever, but I wanted them to make it more relevant. I come back to that relevant again. So in groups of four, they had to create a website for parents of children in elementary school to explain some of the challenges of being left-handed and how the school, this fake school, would help to support those children. And so as part of this website that they made, they had to reflect on their own learning, but the website was really an information website. So sometimes you'll have a website which is just reflection. Maybe your students are going to reflect on their learning and keep an ongoing website, kind of a journal, for example. It could be an information website. It could have been a demonstration website. So you're in science and you want to demonstrate a particular experiment, if you can, at home, then you video it, you put the video onto the website or into YouTube or whatever. Okay? Or it's an explanation. Let me show you how you find the circumference of a circle, etc. So creating a website using Google Sites is a really good example. But they could also demonstrate learning by using a video. Create a video. We've all got phones. There's my phone right there. Why not get them to record themselves, again, reflecting on a particular issue or providing information. The next example I'll have talks about infomercials. Video, these phones that we have now, the software that is with it is great. I mean, with iMovie, for example, you can make 30-second like movie trailers that look amazing. And my students used to do that, and they had a great time making it because it helped them to think and reflect on their learning. I mentioned in that link there, they can make video from a phone or Biteable. Now, if you are not familiar with Biteable, Biteable is what I use to make all those claymation programs that we've been watching over and over and over again today. I'm sure we're all sick of that music by now. I am. So we know I've worked with some of your colleagues, and they had their students create Biteable videos. It's super easy to make. And the Biteable videos are quite handy because, again, you have to think about what you're creating. You can't just write screeds of information. You're limited to certain characters, almost like Twitter. So you have to think very carefully. How am I getting my point across? So there's a lot of interesting thinking that's going on when you're making those kind of Biteable videos. But then you take those videos, whether they're from the phone or from Biteable or whatever other program, and you put it onto YouTube, and you can make a YouTube playlist. All of us as instructors and all the students all have a free YouTube account because it's linked to Google. So, and it's unlimited space, so use it. The other thing is, again, think about making a poster or an infographic. So just things like that. Get the students working to create something that demonstrates their learning or helps them to explain something to other people. It's a really good way of learning. The important thing about this is that when they are demonstrating learning or any kind of work like this, make sure they get feedback. There's no point in them creating something and then everyone looks at it and goes, yeah, that was good. You need to go beyond that. So you may want to think about getting the peers to give formative feedback. So again, you can set up a system where maybe it doesn't have to be the whole class, but maybe in a synchronous environment, you want to look at everybody else's, or maybe they go into breakout rooms with another group and they share it with another group. Giving the formative feedback from the peers or from yourself is very important. But you'll also notice the bottom of that line, it says formative feedback from peers and or instructor and next steps. And that's the important part to learning. So if they get feedback, again, from their peers or from you as the instructor, as part of that feedback, it should say, here's what you could do to make this better, or next time think about this. For example, they've made a video explaining something, and maybe they haven't added any referencing. So maybe you say, next time you do this, make sure you have referencing at the end of your video. Something as simple as that. But giving them a goal to aim for the next time is really important. Another thing that's really helpful to do when you're working with a group of people synchronously, the other thing to think about is argumentation. Pick a side and argue that point. So one of the reasons to do argumentation, or again, pick a side and argue that point, is to help reduce misinformation. It's interesting, you look at the research on this, and argumentation is, the research says that argumentation provides opportunities to reduce misinformation, because if you're going to pick a side and argue a side, you have to know your side, but you also have to know the counter arguments. And so you start digging deeper into your learning. So I found that very fascinating. Also, it improves persuasive communication. Now, again, I'm talking about argumentation not on its own. So when you are doing a synchronous input, think about how you could use argumentation as part of a case study, or as you're working in a group, et cetera, et cetera. So again, all of these things I'm mentioning, please don't just think of them on their own. They all link to the other things I'm talking about. Again, if you have to argue a point, you're going to make sure you understand your subject better, because you're going to have to argue your point and counter argue someone else's point. So it really helps to really get a good grip of the subject. It also ensures opinions are well informed, because again, if you're going to make an opinion, you need to be able to back it up. It's kind of an obvious one, but we often forget this. You have guest speakers. We're all busy making these videos up, but if you have opportunities to have a guest come in and speak, that's pretty helpful. So when you're having a synchronous input, you may want to have a guest speaker do an input. Now, again, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it would be helpful if it could be recorded for those who can't make it for very genuine reasons. However, we also know that there are guest speakers who may not be comfortable doing that. And that's fine. You can't record it if they don't want to. But then this brings up the question, what do you do if you have a guest speaker who's going to be speaking for an hour in a synchronous input and does not want to be recorded? What do you do for those students who genuinely are unable to make it, or whose internet cuts out halfway through? So you may want to think about that. You might want to ask the instructor, or the guest speaker, if you can record it only for you and you'll transcribe it. Again, Zoom will transcribe for you. You may want to say, can I record it so I can take main notes? And again, if the answer is no, then it might be a case of you as the instructor or the TA or QA needs to, TA or RA, may need to take your own notes and then post them for students and afterwards. But that's something you need to negotiate with the guest speaker. But that is something you can do during a synchronous input. Another big one you can do is to practice. I've put flipped teaching in brackets because that's what flipped teaching is. Traditionally, you would come to a lecture, you'd give them the information, and they go away and they practice something. Now we're flipping it around. So we're saying, we're going to give you a lecture at home, and you're going to come to the synchronous input, and then we're going to practice it. So that's something worth thinking about doing during your synchronous input. So take the asynchronous input, and let's learn a skill from that. So let's look at an example of how you could take practice during a synchronous input. So Professor Lisa Stein here at the Faculty of Science, she gives her students a challenging or perhaps an unsolvable problem as part of their asynchronous input. I have spoken to Professor Stein, and she told me I could use her name and use this example. So thank you, Lisa, for that. So she's given the students this challenging, and it might even be an unsolvable problem. It's part of their asynchronous input. They've had time to think about it, to reflect on it, and so on. During the synchronous input, her students are placed in breakout rooms, and she asks them to share their answers and to decide amongst themselves which answer is the best. Each group shares their best answer with the rest of the class. Once the groups have shared, the class determines which answer is best. And then Lisa will have comments after that. If you want more information about that, you can certainly contact Lisa. She'll be able to give you a lot more information. But this is an example of what I'm talking about, where you can really engage students more effectively. This is the one that I think is going to raise a few eyebrows. You can use your synchronous time as a consultation. And this has been mentioned already. Greg mentioned this earlier on. Use your synchronous time as consultation time. So you might say, okay, I'm not going to have any synchronous input in the traditional sense. I'm going to be on call. I'm going to be in a Zoom room, and I'm going to have people come in as they wish. Or they have to book an appointment. But you could use time for that. The nice thing about doing a consultation like this is it provides you the opportunities to amend documentation. So you have a student that comes in and has a consultation time with you during this synchronous time, and you learn maybe over one or two students say the same thing. I'm not quite sure I followed that on eClass, or the materials, I got very confused about this video. I wasn't sure what it meant, or the instructions on eClass weren't clear. And it gives you the opportunity to amend that and go, oh, thanks for letting me know that. I'll fix that right away. So having that conversation with students on a more regular basis than perhaps you would do traditionally gives you the opportunity to nip things in the bud before they become a problem. Certainly in my experience, that was very helpful. I did this, and students were coming with things that I hadn't even thought of. I had my information on eClass. I thought it was very clear, but yet when the students went to do something, they were getting confused. And so during the consultation time, this was coming up very clearly. So I was able to make amendments, inform the students, and then they went on their merry way and everything was fine. Now, the nice little bonus to that is that when it came to the USRIs, the students are going, oh, he was so reactive when we had an issue. He fixed it right away. It was great for my scoring. So it's a little bit of a bonus there. I'd also like to talk really quickly. I want to talk about what I call OOO. So this is something else you can do when you are doing synchronous input. You can do OOO. And let me explain what that is. There are 3 O's. The first O is O with the question mark. So you have the students come to the synchronous input prepared to answer this particular question. Based upon what you did asynchronously, the videos you watched, the reading I had you do, etc. What are you unsure of or need clarification about? Now, again, this can be linked to the other things I've talked about. You could have them discuss this in class, or you could have a Google form which asks them to do this in advance. Maybe you do it through eClass. It doesn't matter. So you could do this like live, or you could have the students answer these questions in advance, which gives you the opportunity to go through and see if there are any commonalities and then be able to respond to that. So the first O is, oh, what are you unsure of or need clarification about? The second one is, oh, what surprised you? What was your main takeaway? You did this, you watched the video, you've done all that work asynchronously. What made you go, huh, wow, I didn't know that. That was really interesting. Oh, I hadn't thought of that before. Oh, that made me think differently about something. So that's the second O. And the third O is, oh, what do you want to learn more about? So something caught your interest, or maybe there wasn't enough information and you want more information, or you're just you understood it. It's not O question mark, but it's, I really want to know more about that in order for me to be able to do something else, perhaps, or in order for me to be able to do the case study. So I call this as the OOO, the 3 O's. O, oh, oh. Okay, so a lot of what I've talked about is coming from a very particular piece of research, not one, but several pieces of research, which is at ctl.guide, and I've given you this small link to it. So I made this link up, but this will link to the new library system that we talked about. So if you want to write that down or copy it, I'll put it into the chat as well. So if you want to have a quick link instead of having to write it all out. So that pretty much is what I want to talk about. The important thing is that there's no right or wrong answer. There's no one way of doing it, but I would say, maybe not the wrong way of doing it, but I would certainly strongly recommend you minimize or avoid altogether the idea of getting students together synchronously and just doing a lecture. The research is very, very clear on this. That is not going to cut the proverbial mustard. It's not going to work because students will, especially now when we're all teaching online, they're going to say, "You're just giving me knowledge. I could have done this on my own. Why do I have to come into the class for this? Why can't you record this and let me watch it on my own time?" So that's an important thing to remember. And when you are making these videos, I mean, again, try to keep them really short. It's really helpful. Um, it's a really important thing to remember. Keep the knowledge transfer asynchronous. So take those ideas that I talked about, case studies, interactive learning, guest speakers, etc., and combine all of them. You don't have to just do one. But equally, you don't have to do the same thing every week. So you can mix things up, make things more interesting for your students as well.